The cypress trees stood like sentinels in the water, their knees breaking the surface of the bayou in gnarled formations that seemed older than memory itself. Mist clung to everything in the pre-dawn hours, thick, wet, alive with the sounds of creatures that knew this land belonged to no man. Elise Marchand moved through it like a ghost, her bare feet finding purchase on roots and mud banks that would have swallowed a stranger whole. She was 26 years old and had been a widow for 3 years. Her husband, Jean-Baptiste, had died defending this 100 acres from a river pirate named Boudreau, who'd decided the land would make a fine trading post. Jean-Baptiste had taken a knife to the gut and bled out in Elise's arms, while Boudreau rode off, laughing. The local magistrate, a Frenchman growing fat on bribes, had called it a dispute between neighbors and closed the matter. That was when Elise learned her first lesson. The law protected men with money, not women with land. The second lesson came from an old Choctaw woman named Falling Water, who still visited the river bend where her people had once camped. Elise had found her gathering pokeweed roots one morning, and instead of chasing her off, had asked what the plant was for. Falling Water had studied her with eyes that missed nothing. The bruises on Elise's wrists from where Boudreau had grabbed her before Jean-Baptiste intervened, the hollowness in her face, the rifle she now carried everywhere. "You want to learn?" Falling Water had asked. "I want to survive," Elise had answered. That had been enough. Now, 3 years later, Elise moved through her land with the confidence of someone who knew every plant, every root, every berry that grew in the wet soil. She knew which mushrooms brought fever dreams and which brought a sleep without waking. She knew how to extract the oil from water hemlock roots, how to dry and powder the seeds of jimson weed, how to brew a tea from white snake root that tasted like nothing at all, but turned a man's organs to failing meat within a week. She had used this knowledge 5 times in 3 years. The first had been Boudreau himself, who'd returned 6 months after Jean-Baptiste's death with a forged deed and 3 men to enforce it. Elise had welcomed them with coffee brewed from chicory and sassafras and white snake root, carefully measured. They'd ridden off laughing at the foolish widow who thought hospitality would save her land. 2 weeks later, Boudreau died vomiting black bile. His men blamed the river water. The second had been a French land agent named Devereux, sent by the colonial governor to negotiate a fair price for her property. He'd tried charm first, then threats, then finally attempted to force himself on her in her own cabin. She'd fought him off with Jean-Baptiste's rifle, but she knew he'd return with soldiers. He never got the chance. The mushroom stew she'd sent to his boarding house as an apology for her rudeness had seen to that. The doctor called it food poisoning from spoiled pork. The third and fourth had come together, American speculators from New Orleans who'd heard Louisiana would soon be sold to the United States and wanted to secure prime river land before the transfer. They'd been businesslike, almost kind, offering her passage to Mobile and a modest sum for her cooperation. When she'd refused, they'd tried to burn her out. She'd been ready. The water they'd drawn from her well to douse the flames they'd set, water she'd treated with crushed oleander leaves, had done its work slowly, painfully. They'd made it back to New Orleans before the convulsions started. No one connected their deaths to a woman living in a swamp 50 miles upriver. The fifth had been just 2 months ago, a river trader named Gascon who'd anchored his flatboat at her landing and refused to leave, claiming squatters' rights since the land clearly wasn't being worked by anyone serious. He'd been drunk and aggressive, firing his pistol into the air to scare the swamp witch. Elise had let him exhaust himself, then offered him bread and honey as a peace offering. The honey had been aged in a jar with crushed foxglove flowers. His heart had stopped 3 days later, and his crew had blamed the Louisiana heat. Now, as the August sun began to burn through the morning mist, Elise stood at the edge of her property and looked out at the Mississippi River rolling past in its eternal, muddy indifference. Somewhere upstream, she knew, another man would be planning, another contract would be drawn, another offer would be made, and she would be ready. She'd learned to feel nothing about it. Not guilt, not satisfaction, not even anger anymore. This was simply what survival required. The land was hers by blood and marriage, and she would defend it the only way a woman without law or protection could, silently, carefully, and without mercy. Falling water had taught her about poison. Life had taught her when to use it. As she turned back toward her cabin, she noticed fresh hoofprints in the mud near the boundary marker, a carved cypress post Jean-Baptiste had set years ago. Someone had been here during the night, surveying, measuring, planning. Elise knelt and studied the tracks. A single horse, well shod. The rider had dismounted, walked the perimeter, taken notes perhaps, then ridden back toward the main river road. She stood slowly, her jaw set. They were coming again. Thomas Winters arrived in Louisiana territory on the first day of September 1802, with 3 trunks of books, a letter of introduction from President Jefferson's secretary, and a mind full of questions about a pattern no one else seemed to notice. He was 32 years old, a physician and naturalist who'd spent the last 5 years studying medicinal plants in the Appalachian Mountains. His interest in Louisiana had been academic at first. The territory was a wilderness of unexplored botanical specimens, and Jefferson's administration was eager for detailed surveys before the anticipated purchase from France. But Thomas's assignment had changed when he'd been shown a disturbing file in the State Department's office. 7 deaths in the past 3 years, all men involved in land acquisitions along a particular stretch of the Mississippi River, all dying of what appeared to be natural causes. 7 deaths, 7 different symptoms, 7 medical reports that didn't quite add up. Thomas had read them all carefully. Boudreaux, acute gastric distress, likely from contaminated food. Devereaux, mushroom poisoning. The 2 American speculators, death by exposure and dehydration, possibly complicated by contaminated water. Gascon, heart failure, not uncommon in the Louisiana heat. But Thomas had noticed what the local doctors hadn't: subtle consistencies, the timing of symptom onset, the progression of organ failure, the presence of certain markers that suggested specific plant toxins rather than random illness. Someone was killing these men, and they were doing it with extraordinary botanical knowledge and patience. His investigation had led him to one common thread: a 100-acre plot owned by a widow named Elise Marchand, who'd refused every attempt to purchase or seize her land. Every dead man had tried to claim it. Thomas wasn't sure what he expected to find. Perhaps a crazed woman living like an animal in the swamps, or a cunning accomplice hiding in New Orleans who did the actual poisoning. What he didn't expect was what he found when he finally located the cabin at the end of a barely visible path through the cypress trees. The property was beautiful. Neat garden rows ran along the high ground behind the cabin, planted with corn, squash, beans, and herbs he recognized: basil, rosemary, sage. A chicken coop stood under the shade of a massive live oak, and he could hear the soft clucking of healthy birds. The cabin itself was well maintained, its cypress plank walls weathered but sound, its roof freshly patched with palmetto fronds. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of baking bread. And sitting on the porch, a rifle across her lap and a book open in her hands, was the most unsettling woman Thomas had ever seen. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair braided and pinned in the French style, and a face that would have been pretty if not for the absolute stillness in her expression. She wore a simple homespun dress, practical boots, and looked at him with eyes the color of swamp water, green-brown, unreadable, ancient. "You're on private property," she said in French. Her voice was soft, almost musical. It was the voice of someone who rarely needed to raise it. Thomas dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible. He answered in French, his accent marking him as an outsider, but competent. "Madame Marchand, My name is Thomas Winters. I'm a physician and naturalist, sent by the American government to survey the territory. I was hoping to speak with you about the local flora." She closed her book slowly. He noticed it was Rousseau, and stood. The rifle remained in her hands, pointed at nothing and everything. "Men who come here asking questions usually want something other than knowledge, Dr. Winters. I assure you I have no interest in your land. I'm a scientist, not a speculator." "Then you're a fool. This is the most valuable river frontage between Natchez and New Orleans. Everyone wants it." Thomas chose his next words carefully. "Everyone who wanted it is dead." The silence that followed was profound. A heron called from somewhere in the swamp. The river whispered against the bank. Elise Marchand's expression didn't change at all, but Thomas felt the temperature of the conversation drop 10 degrees. "Accidents happen," she said. "The swamp is dangerous. Men who don't respect it pay the price. I've read the death reports, madame. Those weren't accidents, they were assassinations." Now something flickered across her face. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. She was deciding whether he was a threat, whether he would leave her land alive. Thomas continued, his voice steady. "Water hemlock, amanita mushrooms, oleander, foxglove, white snake root. Each death corresponded to a specific plant toxin. Each dose was calibrated to kill slowly enough that no one connected it to a specific source. It's brilliant, really, and terrifying." Elise tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You seem very certain of your theory, Dr. Winters. Have you shared it with the authorities?" "No." "Why not?" Thomas took a breath. This was the moment that would determine everything. "Because I understand why it happened." Her grip on the rifle tightened almost imperceptibly. "Do you? Your husband was murdered defending this land. The law did nothing. You were left alone. A woman in a territory where property law barely exists, and violence is the only language most men speak. You defended yourself the only way you could, with knowledge they didn't have and couldn't see coming. You became exactly what they feared, something in the swamp that kills trespassers. It kept you alive." The silence stretched. Then Elise lowered the rifle slightly, not setting it down but no longer quite pointing it at him either. "What do you want, Dr. Winters?" "To understand, and to offer you a choice." "What choice?" Thomas gestured at the land around them. "Louisiana will be American territory soon. New laws, new systems, new people flooding in who don't care about old French land grants or widows' rights. You can keep killing them, and eventually someone will notice the pattern, or someone will simply come with enough men that poison won't save you. Or you can accept help from someone who understands what you've done and why, and who might be able to protect you legally instead of just documenting how you've protected yourself." Elise laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You want to protect me, a strange man I met 5 minutes ago who just accused me of serial murder. I want to understand the plants you're using. I want to document them for medical purposes. Properly dosed, some of these toxins could be valuable medicines. In exchange, I can help you establish legal title that will hold up under American law. I have connections in Washington, and I'll stay here, on your land. So anyone else who comes looking will have to go through me first. You'd stay here, in the swamp, protecting a woman you believe is a killer." "Yes." "Why?" Thomas met her swamp-green eyes and told her the truth. "Because you're the most interesting thing I've found in 10 years of studying how humans survive impossible situations. And because I think you're right, the land is yours, and what you did to keep it was justice, not murder." Elise Marchand stood on her porch for a long moment, the rifle still in her hands, weighing his words against every betrayal she'd ever known. Then she made a decision that would change both their lives. "There's a guest cabin behind the main house," she said. "You can stay there. But if you touch my things, if you bring anyone else here without my permission, if you ever threaten me or this land, you'll learn firsthand how creative I can be with the plants that grow in this swamp." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Understood. And, Dr. Winters, I haven't admitted to anything. As far as anyone knows, I'm just a widow who knows how to garden." "Of course, Madame Marchand." She finally set the rifle down and picked up her book. "You can call me Elise. If you're going to live here, we might as well be civilized about it." Thomas smiled for the first time since arriving. Thomas. And so began the strangest collaboration in Louisiana territory. A scholar seeking truth and a survivor seeking safety, bound together by secrets that grew in the dark soil between them. The first week passed in careful distance. Thomas set up his workspace in the guest cabin, a small, sturdy structure that had once housed Jean-Baptiste's hunting equipment. It smelled of cedar and gun oil, and at night he could hear the swamp coming alive. Frogs singing their ancient songs, gators bellowing in the shallows, owls hunting in the cypress canopy. He wrote detailed notes by candlelight, sketching plants and recording his observations about the land, the river, the woman who defended both with silent violence. Elise kept to herself, working her garden, tending her chickens, reading on her porch. But Thomas noticed she was always aware of where he was, always watching, testing him. On the 8th day, he made his first real offering. He'd spent the morning walking the property boundaries with his field notebook, cataloguing every plant species he could identify. When he returned, he found Elise harvesting squash in her garden, her dress damp with humidity, her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed straw hat. He approached slowly, making noise so as not to startle her. "I found water hemlock growing near the eastern boundary," he said. "Cicuta maculata. The root structure matches the descriptions in my botanical texts, but I've never seen it fresh. The purple-streaked stems are remarkable." Elise straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside. If we're going to discuss this, we do it properly." The interior of her cabin surprised him. He'd expected something sparse, utilitarian. Instead, he found a home. Books lined one wall, French philosophy, English poetry, botanical guides, even some medical texts that looked like they'd belonged to Jean-Baptiste. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with complex scents, mint and sage, lavender, and something darker he couldn't identify. A well-used writing desk sat beneath the window, covered with careful sketches of plants and meticulous notes in French. Elise poured them each a cup of water from a clay pitcher. He noticed she drank first, a subtle reassurance, and sat across from him at the rough-hewn table. "What do you want to know?" she asked. Thomas opened his notebook. "Everything. How you learned, what you've used, how you measured dosages. I want to understand the science of what you've done. Why should I trust you with that? Because I'm the only person who's figured it out and hasn't tried to arrest you or kill you, and because knowledge this precise deserves to be recorded, even if it can never be published." Something shifted in Elise's expression, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the woman beneath the survivor. "You really are a scholar, aren't you? You care more about the plants than the crimes." "I care about both. But I think the plants are extraordinary, and I think you're extraordinary for mastering them. Most physicians in Philadelphia couldn't dose digitalis properly if their lives depended on it, but you've been calculating lethal doses of 5 different toxins with enough precision that no one suspected murder. That's not cruelty, that's genius." Elise was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and retrieved a leather-bound journal from a hidden compartment in her desk. She set it on the table between them. "Falling water taught me to see," she said, "to watch what animals avoided, what insects wouldn't touch, what caused sickness when handled carelessly. She showed me how to test, tiny doses on mice, observations over weeks. She taught me that plants aren't good or evil, they're just tools. What matters is the hand that wields them." Thomas opened the journal carefully. Inside, in Elise's precise handwriting, was a complete record of her education. Sketches of plants with detailed notes on identification, preparation methods, symptom timelines, and dosage calculations based on body weight and method of administration. It was better than most medical texts he'd studied. "This is incredible," he whispered. "This is survival," she corrected. "Every page is a reason I'm still alive." They spent the afternoon going through it together, Thomas asking questions, Elise explaining her methods, both of them falling into the rhythm of teacher and student, expert and apprentice. She showed him how to identify water hemlock by the purple streaks and chambered root structure, how to extract the cicotoxin without poisoning yourself, how to disguise it in coffee or stew so the bitter taste vanished beneath other flavors. She explained how she'd learned to dry amanita mushrooms and powder them, how a pinch mixed into flour could cause liver failure that looked exactly like food poisoning. She demonstrated the preparation of oleander leaf tea, careful timing, specific temperatures, straining 3 times to get the concentration right. Foxglove is the most dangerous to handle, she said, showing him dried leaves preserved in paper packets. The dose that slows the heart and the dose that stops it are very close. I almost killed myself testing it. Falling water had to make me drink activated charcoal for 2 days. Thomas listened, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. This was medicine and murder intertwined. Healing knowledge turned to lethal purpose. Every technique Elise described could save lives in proper doses, digitalis for heart conditions, small amounts of hemlock as a sedative, carefully measured belladonna for pain relief. But she'd learned to wield them as weapons instead. The white snake root was the hardest to perfect, she continued. Ageratina altissima. It causes milk sickness. The toxin accumulates slowly, and symptoms don't appear for weeks. That's what made it perfect for Boudreau. He thought he was safe because nothing happened immediately. How did you know it would work? Elise's expression darkened. Falling Water's daughter died from it as a child. Drank milk from a cow that had grazed on snake root. It took 3 weeks. Falling Water watched her die and couldn't stop it. When she taught me about the plant, she cried. I think she knew what I would use it for. Thomas closed the journal carefully. Do you regret any of it? Elise looked at him with those ancient swamp water eyes. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the world is built so that a woman must become poisoned to stay alive. But I don't regret surviving, Thomas, and I won't apologize for protecting what's mine. He nodded slowly. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if you want to stop. Stop? Killing. If I can protect this land legally, if I can make sure no one else comes with contracts and guns, would you be willing to stop? Elise stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land Jean-Baptiste had died for, the land she'd killed to keep. The afternoon sun turned the cypress trees to gold, and the river flowed endless and indifferent beyond them. I'll believe in your legal protections when I see them work, she said finally. Until then, I'll keep my garden growing and my knowledge sharp, because men don't stop wanting things, Thomas. They just send different men to take them. Then we'll deal with them together, no more poison, at least not as the first option. Let me try diplomacy first. She turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she smiled, small, sad, real. You're either very brave or very foolish, Doctor. Winters? Probably both. That's what I thought when I married Jean-Baptiste too. He wanted to build something good here. Thought honor and hard work would be enough. Her smile faded. They weren't. Thomas stood and met her eyes. Then we'll be smarter than honor and harder than work. We'll use law, knowledge, and if necessary, as a last resort, we'll use what grows in your garden. But we'll do it together. Elise studied him for a long moment, weighing trust against survival, hope against experience. Then she extended her hand. Together, she agreed. They shook on it, physician and poisoner, scholar and survivor, 2 people choosing to stand on shared ground against whatever came next. And in the swamps of Louisiana, where the law was weak and violence was common, that alliance was about to be tested in ways neither of them could predict. 3 weeks after Thomas's arrival, the test came in the form of a flat boat flying an American flag, carrying 6 armed men and a land surveyor named Caldwell, who'd been hired by a New Orleans banking consortium. They anchored at Elise's landing without permission, unloaded surveying equipment, and began marking the property as if it already belonged to them. Thomas saw them first. He was down by the river collecting specimens when the boat arrived, and he immediately recognized the threat. These weren't individual speculators or drunken traders. This was organized, official, backed by money and the assumption of American authority in a territory that technically still belonged to France. He ran back to find Elise already watching from the tree line, rifle in hand. "Let me talk to them first," Thomas said quietly. "Talk won't stop men like that." "Maybe not, but if it doesn't, we'll try it your way. Please, let me try." Elise hesitated, then nodded once. "You have until sunset. If they're still here after dark, I'm handling it." Thomas walked down to the landing with his hands visible and a carefully neutral expression. Caldwell was a thin man in his 40s, with the pinched face of someone who'd spent too many years enforcing contracts he didn't believe in. He looked up from his surveying equipment with barely concealed irritation. "You're trespassing on property currently under survey for the Mississippi River Commerce Company," Caldwell said. "I'll have to ask you to leave." "Actually," Thomas said calmly, "you're trespassing on property legally owned by Madame Elise Marchand under French colonial land grant dated 1795. I'm Dr. Thomas Winters, representing her interests. I have documentation." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "French land grants will be reviewed and likely invalidated once the Louisiana purchase is finalized. This land is more valuable than a widow can manage, and the company I represent has the capital and connections to develop it properly. The Louisiana purchase hasn't happened yet. French law still applies, and even when American law takes over, this grant will hold up. It's properly registered, fully paid, and includes mineral and water rights. I've already filed the relevant papers with the Territorial Governor's office in New Orleans." This was partially a bluff. Thomas had filed paperwork, but it would take months to process. But Caldwell didn't know that. "Dr. Winters," Caldwell said with forced patience, "I don't know what your arrangement with the Marchand widow is, but this land is going to be acquired one way or another. The company I work for doesn't make offers it can't enforce. Now, you seem like an educated man. Surely you understand that a woman living alone in the swamps isn't equipped to hold valuable river frontage against legitimate commercial interests." "What I understand," Thomas said, his voice hardening, "is that 7 men have died trying to take this land in the past 3 years. All of them thought they had legitimate claims. All of them are in graves now or burned on funeral pyres in New Orleans. Have you asked yourself why that is, Mr. Caldwell?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Caldwell's face. "Accidents, disease, the swamp is dangerous." "The swamp isn't what's dangerous. What's dangerous is assuming that intelligence, determination, and the will to survive are qualities only men possess. Madame Marchand has defended this land against river pirates, colonial agents, and American speculators. She's still here. They're not. I'd suggest you consider that before you continue your survey." Caldwell glanced at his armed men, who were listening with growing unease. The story of the widow's land had spread in whispers through every trading post between Natchez and New Orleans. Men died there, inexplicably, inevitably. Some said it was cursed. Some said the widow was a witch. No one said she was a genius with botanical toxins, but the fear was the same. "Are you threatening me, Dr. Winters?" "I'm educating you. There's a difference. I'm offering you the opportunity to leave peacefully, report to your employers that this land is legally secured and physically defended, and avoid becoming the 8th man to die trying to take it. That's not a threat. It's professional advice from someone who's studied the patterns here more carefully than you have." The silence that followed was tense. Caldwell's men were openly nervous now, one of them muttering about not getting paid enough to fight a witch in her own swamp. Caldwell himself was calculating. Thomas could see it in his eyes. The surveyor was a businessman, not a fighter. He valued his life more than his commission. "I'll need to report this to my employers," Caldwell said finally. "Please do. And when you report it, mention that Dr. Thomas Winters, physician and naturalist working under commission from the American State Department, is currently residing on the property and has verified its legal status. That should give them pause. It was a calculated risk, invoking government authority he didn't technically have. But it worked. Caldwell gathered his men, packed his surveying equipment with deliberate slowness to save face, and returned to the flatboat. Within an hour, they were gone downriver. Thomas stood at the landing until the boat disappeared around the bend, then walked back to find Elise waiting in the shadow of the cypress trees. "Impressive," she said. "You lied very convincingly." "I didn't lie. I just implied connections that aren't quite as solid as I suggested. And when they come back with more men, with soldiers maybe, your implications won't stop bullets, Thomas. Then we'll have time to make your legal claim ironclad. I'll write to Washington tonight. I do have genuine contacts there, and Jefferson's administration is desperate for detailed territorial surveys. If I can make you valuable to them as a source of botanical knowledge, they'll protect you as an asset." Elise shook her head slowly, but she was almost smiling. "You're trying to turn a poisoner into a government resource. I'm trying to turn a survivor into someone the law protects instead of hunts. There's a difference." They walked back to the cabin together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the swamp in shades of amber and blood red. Thomas had bought them time, but they both knew it was temporary. More men would come. They always did. The question was whether legal protections could be built fast enough to matter. That night, Thomas wrote letters by candlelight, to colleagues in Philadelphia, to contacts in Washington, to anyone who might help establish Elise's claim in the messy transition between French and American sovereignty. He wrote about the botanical wealth of her land, the medicinal plants that grew there, the potential scientific value of preserving the area as a natural laboratory. He didn't mention the 7 graves. Across the yard in her cabin, Elise sat at her desk and wrote in her journal. She added a new entry, not about plants this time, but about something more dangerous, hope. She wrote about a scholar who'd chosen to stand beside her instead of against her. A man who saw her as something other than a witch or a monster. Someone who believed her land could be protected with law instead of poison. She wrote about the terrifying possibility that she might not have to kill again. And then, because she was still a survivor first and a dreamer second, she went out into her garden and checked her stores. The foxglove was drying properly. The water hemlock roots were sealed in oil. The white snake root was growing thick along the eastern boundary, just in case. Because in 1802, in the swamps of Louisiana, hope was a luxury and poison was insurance. And Elise Marchand had learned long ago to trust what she could measure, mix and control. But now, for the first time since Jean-Baptiste died in her arms, she had something else too, an ally. Someone who understood what she'd done and why, who saw her violence as justice rather than madness, someone who believed she deserved to keep what was hers without having to kill for it. Thomas Winters had come to study patterns of death. What he'd found was a woman fighting to live. And in the strange, fragile alliance they'd built, part scientific collaboration, part mutual protection, part something neither of them quite had words for yet, there was the first real possibility that Elise might survive not just through fear, but through recognition, that the law might finally protect what violence had defended. 3 months later, when the Louisiana Purchase was finalized and American authority became official, Thomas's letters bore fruit. Elise's land was registered as a protected natural survey site, with full legal title secured under her name. A formal letter from the State Department arrived, thanking her for her cooperation in documenting the region's botanical resources and requesting her continued assistance. Caldwell's employers never came back, neither did anyone else. The story of the widow's land remained a whispered legend, the place where men died mysteriously, where something in the swamp protected its own. But now it had another layer: official American protection, scientific value, legal documentation that even the most aggressive speculators couldn't challenge without facing government scrutiny. Elise Marchand kept her garden growing. She kept her knowledge sharp and her journal updated. She kept foxglove drying in her rafters and water hemlock sealed in oil, because trust was earned slowly and safety was never guaranteed. But she also kept something new: a colleague, an ally, and gradually, across shared meals and botanical discussions, through quiet evenings reading on her porch while Thomas sketched specimens nearby, a friend. Thomas stayed in Louisiana, studying and documenting, sending reports back to Washington that made Elise's land too valuable to seize and her knowledge too useful to silence. He never published what he'd learned about the 7 dead men. Some knowledge, he decided, was better kept in a journal locked in a desk drawer, read only by 2 people who understood that survival sometimes required becoming exactly what the world feared most. And in the swamps where cypress trees stood eternal and the river flowed indifferent to human justice, 2 people who'd found each other through violence and scholarship built something rare: a life defended not by death, but by the quiet, patient work of making law serve the living instead of only the powerful. The plants still grew in Elise's garden, medicines and poisons, healing and harm, depending only on dose and intention. But she never had to use them that way again. Not because the world became gentler, but because she'd finally found someone who believed she deserved safety without having to kill for it, and who was willing to build that safety with her, one careful document and legal filing at a time, until the land Jean-Baptiste died for and she defended with lethal knowledge became hers by law as well as blood. In 1802, in the swamps of Louisiana, justice came not from courts or sheriffs, but from a woman who knew which plants could stop a heart and a scholar who knew which words could move a government. Together, they wrote a different ending, one where the woman who'd poisoned every trader who touched her land never had to poison again, because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you use, it's the one you no longer need.